and thank you for taking time out of the day wherever you may be located to attend this webinar. I'm Steve Bistritz, the developer of the SellXL workshop and co-author of the new book, Selling to the C-Suite, which is based on the workshop. On the screen now, you should see my contact information displayed, as well as the SellXL website information. We have attendees in this session today from all over the world, literally every continent. So welcome all. During this webinar, you'll be given a chance to ask questions. You should see an area on your control panel that allows you to submit a question. I may try to answer some of those questions during the session. However, I may also try to decide to answer the questions at the end of the session when there is more time allocated for questions from attendees. My main objective today is to provide you with an overview of the SellXL workshop, and more importantly, the value it can deliver to your salespeople and to your sales organization. So to honor your time today, and for all of you who have logged in on time, I'm going to get started. Again, I'm Steve Bistritz, the developer of the SellXL workshop and co-author of the new book, Selling to the C-Suite. Let's talk about the workshop and what it provides to the attendees. SellXL is a practical one-day workshop that is aimed at professional business-to-business salespeople to help them create, maintain, and leverage relationships with executives at the executive level. Now, what you're going to see in this workshop is that it was designed from the perspective of the executive themselves. We did research with executives where we asked them about their relationships with professional salespeople. And I'll tell you more about that as we go through the presentation today. But here are the outcomes that participants should be able to do after attending the one-day workshop. Number one, they're going to be able to identify the relevant executive to call on for the sales opportunity. And let me tell you how I define the relevant executive. I define the relevant executive as the executive who stands to gain the most or lose the most as a result of the application or project associated with the sales opportunity. So that may be a little bit different from what you're used to defining as perhaps the economic buyer or the decision maker. I define the relevant executive, and we're going to spend a little bit more time on that concept in a few minutes. Secondly, you're going to be able to develop the best approach for the initial call on the executive based on what executives told us was the best way to get to them. Third, you're going to be able to determine how to become perceived as the trusted advisor to the executive so that you get return access. You know, most salespeople can gain initial access to the executive. It's getting that return access, getting the executive to perhaps call you and ask you for your advice on issues that are totally unrelated to your product or service. And lastly, we're going to help you describe and communicate your value to the executive on an ongoing basis using the client's metrics. So let's talk about the workshop modules and how they're positioned within the workshop. We start off with a section on why call on executives. So it's not really an introduction module. It's more about why should a salesperson be trying to establish relationships with senior client executives. Secondly, how do you target the right executive to call on? How do you identify that relevant executive for the sales opportunity? And then how do you gain access to that executive? Again, based on what executives told us was the best way to get to them. Then we'll talk about establishing your credibility. How do you become perceived as the trusted advisor to the executive? What do you have to do? And most importantly, I'll ask salespeople a lot of times, how do you know that you're the trusted advisor? What has the executive done for you or to you to demonstrate that you are the trusted advisor? And lastly, we have a module focused on creating and communicating your value to the executive. And that's probably one of the most important things we talk about in the workshop, because executives want to understand the value that you have created and delivered to them as a result of your solution that you installed for the business initiative that you perhaps addressed in the client organization. So in workshops that I conduct for salespeople, I'll ask them in the workshop, what are some of the challenges that you have in calling on executives? And if I'm talking to a group of salespeople, I'll say to them, well, I know that none of the people in this room have a challenge, so tell me perhaps about a friend of yours that may have a challenge in calling on executives. And here's what we hear from salespeople across the world. Number one, how do you identify the right executive to call on? How do you identify that relevant executive for the sales opportunity? And then how do you get past the gatekeeper? How do you get past a roadblock that perhaps the executive has put in place for salespeople that are calling on them? How do you develop an understanding of the executive's key business issues so that you're not intimidated by questions that could arise during the course of your meeting or during the course of a conversation with an executive? They don't have an understanding of the politics of the client organization so that they are concerned about jeopardizing lower-level relationships. And what we do in the SellXL workshop is basically mitigate each and every one of these challenges. We address each of these challenges with the modules that you saw in the previous slide. So this workshop was based on research that we conducted with CXO level executives, where we asked them about their relationships with professional salespeople. And here are some of the areas that we covered in that research and in those interviews we conducted with CXO level executives, nearly 500 executives around the world on each continent. We asked them questions like, when and why did executives like yourself get involved in the decision process for major purchases? What has to happen in meetings with salespeople for you, the executive, to feel it was an effective meeting? Then we asked them, how do salespeople establish trust and credibility with you so that they get return access? And then lastly, we talked about what are executives looking for in strategic relationships with suppliers. Now let me show you how they answered that first question. When and why did executives get involved in the decision process for major purchases? And we showed them a typical buying cycle, the steps in the buying cycle, as you see here on the graph. Now it's not important to identify each and every one of those steps, but to understand that typically there are a series of steps that happen within that buying cycle. And you could categorize these as early and middle and late in that buying cycle. And when we asked the executives that question, here's how they responded. First of all, they told us they get involved early in the process to help establish the objectives and set the strategy for the project. And then also, what surprised us was they said they get involved late to help plan the implementation and measure the results. And again, another surprise, what they told us in the middle of the buying cycle, they have less involvement. They tend to delegate down to lower-level executives these areas of the buying cycle. And if you look at those steps, that's typically where our sales cycle starts. So if we don't have access to a senior-level executive and we expect to get to them early in the buying process, that's not going to happen. So it's better to get those executive relationships established so that you can get early access, so you can help establish the objectives for the project, so that you can help the client executive write an RFP instead of being here in the middle of the buying cycle when you just receive an RFP. Most importantly, executives said that they want to get involved late in that cycle to measure the results. They want to understand the value that your solution has delivered to them. So make certain that you make that call on the executive after your solution has been installed and communicate the value that your solution has delivered to that client. Executives want to see you at that time, and that's what our research showed. So we talk about this in our SellXL workshop. And here's the quote. This came from an executive that I interviewed in that CXO research that we did. I asked an executive, I said to the CIO of a major corporation, after we asked them all the other questions, I said, now tell me why you would meet with a professional salesperson. And here's what he said. I meet with professional salespeople because often they can offer me solutions that even people in my own organization can't develop. They've seen these problems in other organizations, and I want the benefit of their experience. So that's why salespeople should not be intimidated by the rank of the executive they're calling on. Executives at any rank understand that professional salespeople can deliver value to them, and that's why they want to meet with you. Now, I tell salespeople that there are 3 compelling questions that should be asked at multiple times in a sales campaign. And those questions are as follows. Number 1, should we pursue this opportunity? What's happening in the client environment that's creating the need for change, the need for our solution? Secondly, can we effectively compete for this opportunity? Do we have a solution that can be integrated into the client's environment? And has the client executive understood the specific business value that our solution can deliver to them? Because if you can't differentiate the value of your solution, you cannot compete effectively. And lastly, can we reasonably expect to win this opportunity? Are we aligned with the relevant executive for the sales opportunity who can help us win the deal? Because typically there's 2 types of decision-making processes that are going on within a client organization. There's the formal process that may be articulated in an RFP, but there's also an informal decision process taking place that the relevant executive can impact. And informal always trumps formal. That relevant executive can usurp the buying decision that was made as part of the formal buying process and opt for your solution if you're aligned with that relevant executive. So we're going to talk in the next module about how do you target the right executive? How do you get aligned with the relevant executive for the sales opportunity? How do you identify that executive? And again, let's talk about this and put the definition in place again. I talked about it earlier, defining the relevant executive, the executive who initiated the project or application, but most importantly, the executive who stands to gain the most or lose the most by the outcome of the project or application associated with the sales opportunity. Remember that. Repeat that to yourself as you're looking at and in the midst of a sales campaign or pursuing a sales opportunity. That's the relevant executive for the sales opportunity. Now, let me give you an example and show you how that really works in practice. And in the SellXL workshop, we use a case study. It's about this company called Jakia International. and you are the TRK system salesperson calling on this fictitious company called Jakia International. And this case study has been used by clients who sell products, by clients who sell services, and it's used by clients around the world. The case study resonates with any business-to-business salesperson. And what we do in the SellXL workshop, the first question we ask, is there an opportunity to pursue at this company? Obviously, the answer to that is yes. Secondly, do we have a solution that enables us to compete for the opportunity? Again, a resounding yes. The third question is, can we win the opportunity calling on key players with whom we have already established a relationship? And most salespeople will conclude that they can't, and we'll talk about that more in just a minute. We have to identify the relevant executive for the sales opportunity, and we have to target that executive. We have to try to gain access to that executive. And we talk about in the workshop the multiple ways that we could gain access to that executive. So let's take this to yet another level and display this typically for you. Here's an organization chart that reflects the organization chart for the case study. And the first question we ask is, who has the formal power for a decision on a new IT solution? And most people can answer that question easily. And if you look at the organization chart, and here's, like I said, a typical organization chart, you can see from this chart who would have that authority. And that's another point. We talk about an organization chart and the types of information salespeople can gain from just looking at an organization chart. Number one, you can look at this organization chart and see the rank and authority that people have within the organization, who reports to who, and who has typical formal power and authority for decisions. You can also tell the function from an organization chart. You know, who is responsible for doing what in the organization. And you see the different silos. You see the operations silo, you see the information systems silo right here, and then you see the financial silo right here. And if we ask who has the formal powers for this decision on a new IT solution, most people would concur that these two individuals, the IT director and the CIO, have the formal power. Now, if I asked you who has the informal power, just looking at this organization chart, you can't determine that information. Influence and power happen behind the scenes. And we'll talk in a minute where that influence and power comes from. But typically, you can't identify influence and power from the organization chart. It so happens that these two people here have the informal power for this decision, the CFO and the CEO. And in fact, Benjamin Wu, the CFO for this particular company, is the relevant executive for the sales opportunity. And again, you couldn't see that from the organization chart, but from what's happening behind the scenes, if this particular application or project goes well, Benjamin Wu stands to become the CEO of this company because the current CEO, Stephen Markup here, is going to retire within the next 18 to 24 months. So again, you couldn't determine that from the organization chart, but if you have information from behind the scenes, from talking to different people in the client organization, from talking to your sponsors and mentors, from seeing what happens in the organization when decisions are made and decisions take place, you can develop an understanding of who that relevant executive is. And here are some of the sources of informal power. People with informal power typically possess that power because of their previous or current relationships, reputation for past or current for performance, what have they done in the past for this company or for other companies. They may have control of key resources, or they may have some level of subject matter expertise. And it can be a combination of these factors that helps identify the sources of informal power and who that relevant executive for the sales opportunity is. So let's move on and talk about how are we going to gain access to this executive, the executive that we need to get to in order to close the deal that we're currently pursuing. Now, one of the things I'm going to tell you is in the SellXL workshop, I'm showing you some of the visuals that come directly from that workshop. But the workshop is primarily activity-oriented. We do lots of activities during that one-day workshop. About 50% or more of the workshop is about the activities that are conducted against this case study. And here are the different approaches to gaining access. I've populated this particular slide, and you see the different ways that you might gain access to executives. And if I asked you to vote on which one of these is the best way to get to the executive, I'm not sure that most of you could identify that what executives told us was the best way to get to them. And here's what they told us. Here's what executives said to this question. Assuming your company was considering a major purchase, how likely would you be to schedule a meeting with a salesperson if that request came from these different sources? And you can see here, if a recommendation came from someone inside your company, what we call the referral in the previous slide, 84% of the time executives said they would see that salesperson. If the referral came from outside the company, again, 44% of the time they said they would meet with that salesperson. So those are the best ways to get to the executive. And on the previous slide, I also talked about treating the gatekeeper as a resource. And that's another way that I would tell you to look at as a source to get to executives in the client organization. Treat that gatekeeper as if he or she was the executive. And you define that, your approach to the executive, you use the same approach with the gatekeeper. So, because they understand what's going on in the client organization. They have an understanding of what that executive's key business issues are and the areas that that executive likes to focus on. So if you can convince that gatekeeper that you should get a meeting with the executive, it'll be easier, and your process with the executive will be a lot easier also. So let's talk about how you might prepare your approach for that initial telephone call on the executive. And we spend a little bit of time on this in the SellXL workshop. We tell salespeople that even if a sponsor is helping them get a meeting with the executive, they're going to have to make that phone call to the executive or to the gatekeeper to get a meeting with the executive. And in 3 to 5 minutes, here's what you have to cover. You've got to introduce yourself. Why are you contacting the executive? You've got to state very clearly and specifically the purpose of your call. You may want to have a meeting with the executive, or put a meeting together with multiple people from the client organization to help define your solution. You also have to gain credibility very quickly with the executive, perhaps by explaining the homework you've done on their organization and how you've helped other companies address similar challenges. And lastly, you have to propose a clear and specific action that you would like the executive to take as a result of this conversation with him or her. Now here's an example of one of the activities we actually do in the SellXL workshop. And this is on the relevant executive at Jakia International. You're going to develop your telephone approach. And we're very precise on the steps we want the salesperson to use to develop a little script on how you're going to approach the executive. And we have worksheets that we use in combination with the activity to help the salesperson formulate the activity and actually for them to use in their territories when they return to their territories and try to approach executives that they're trying to reach in their client organizations. Now, we also talk about how you address roadblocks, because the inevitable roadblocks will happen when you're calling on an executive. Number one, we talk about the causes of roadblocks. In many organizations, executives put roadblocks in place for salespeople that are trying to get to them. So there are legitimate reasons for roadblocks that are in place, and we also talk about what techniques can be implemented to address or circumvent them. And one of the activities we do in the SellXL workshop, we have a discussion around these two questions, and then we have a multi-page handout with different ways that you can use to circumvent roadblocks. What kind of things can a salesperson do to get around the inevitable roadblocks? Let's talk now about how you establish your credibility with client executives. Number one, you have to look at what the key components of credibility are. And this comes really from a book that I really recommend to all salespeople, and it's called Clients for Life, How Professional Salespeople Develop Breakthrough Relationships. And first on this slide, you see capability. But if a salesperson just demonstrates capability, they could be perceived as an expert pair of hands or an expert for hire. If they also, or if they just demonstrate integrity, they could come across as being reliable and trustworthy. But when they demonstrate both components, that's when they operate in the client value zone, what Clients for Life described as the client value zone. And here's where the salesperson becomes perceived as the trusted advisor. Here's where the relationship becomes collaborative. And again, as I talked about at the beginning of this webinar, how does a salesperson become perceived as a trusted advisor? And when I ask salespeople that question, I ask the follow-up question, okay, tell me what the executive has done for you or to you to demonstrate that they perceive you as a trusted advisor. And that's when people have to start and think and really look back. And I would ask you to look at your own territories and your own situations and see where you have become that trusted advisor. What did you do to get to that level of relationship with the client executive? What capability did you demonstrate? What level of integrity did you demonstrate? Over what period of time did you demonstrate those characteristics? Now, the other thing we talk about in the workshop is different perspectives at different levels of the organization. And salespeople have to understand that when they're calling on these different levels of the organization, they have to have different conversations. At the operations level, that person is going to be focused on price and discounts. People at the management level, they're focused on how your solution can be integrated into the client environment. What's the solution fit? Executives are looking at other uses of funds. So your competitor might not be the traditional competitor that you're up against, but it could be some other use of funds that that executive has money earmarked for. Because executives have a company-wide view of what's happening in their organization. People at the management level, they have a department or function view. People at the operations level, they typically have a very myopic project view. And it's interesting, in looking at different types of industries, I've had a lot of focus on high-tech industries. But I've also focused on many other different industries. And for example, several weeks ago, I was calling on a healthcare executive. And we were talking about some of the challenges that he has now in calling on some of the people and executives in the client organizations he's dealing with. In hospitals, for example, in dealing at the operations level of a hospital for his products and solutions, he has to have a different conversation with that operations level person than if he's calling on the CEO of the hospital, who has a hospital-wide view of what's going on in that organization and what objectives he or she is trying to accomplish. So you have to understand when you're dealing with people at these different levels, you have to be talking their terms, using their metrics, and understanding what their area of focus on. And we have a lot of conversation about this and discussion about this in the SellXL workshop. We also spend a lot of time about learning about your clients. If you remember back to some of the challenges that salespeople had, they said that one of their challenges is, have we really talked about the conversations properly as we're going through this process? And as you look at the different ways of learning about your clients, you're looking at different levels. You're looking at your client's industry. You're looking at your client's company. You're looking after the client's customers, the client's competitors, and also the client executive. You know, what's happening with that client at those three levels? And also, what kind of websites have you accessed to get that information? For example, your client's industry, here's a website to go to. Your client's company, how many out there have used Hoover's as a way of getting information? And there's free information that you can get on Hoover's. There's fee-based information that you can get on Hoover's. And there are lots of other websites like that that you can get answers from, that you can get information from. The client executive, how many of you have looked at perhaps using LinkedIn as a way to get information about that key client executive and finding out, you know, what kinds of contacts that you may have that can get you access to that client executive? What other types of social networking have you used to get information about some of the people in the client organization? Now, let's talk about making that initial face-to-face call on the executive. And again, in our workshop, we have people actually go through and develop this approach to getting to the executive. What are they going to say when they get to that executive? And the first thing we say is, you know, you've obviously got to introduce yourself. You've got to cite some of your past experience. And you're going to see the pie pieces come up here. And they're going to show you the relative amount of time that you should spend in a call on each of these areas. The second area is you're going to be talking about issues and implications. You're going to be asking questions that confirm your level of preparation, and then discussing issues and implications using the client's metrics. Also, you're going to confirm the importance of a key business initiative. I had a call on a client executive fairly recently, and his subordinate asked me to come in and talk about my SellXL workshop. And when I got to the meeting, I said to the executive, you know, before I spend time talking about my workshop, I want to understand what some of your issues are, what some of your problems are in terms of the salespeople that you have in your organization. And I asked him a very telling question and the conversation just expanded around this question. I said to the executive, tell me the 2 or 3 things that your salespeople are not doing today. Which one of those are most important to you and why? And he sat back in his chair and he said, I never had anybody ask me that type of question, and I have to think about it for a minute. But by the end of the conversation, which originally was supposed to be an hour, I had 2.5 hours with this executive where we went into detail about some of the things that he thought his salespeople should be doing that they weren't doing at the current time. And then you have to talk about what are your solution options. And perhaps, you know, in your initial call, you may not have a firmly developed solution yet for that executive. But what do you talk about here? Get a vision of the optimal solution from the executive, and then confirm the value of what a solution like that might be. And then lastly, you want to have a moving forward plan, an action plan that involves the executive, that gets you access again to that executive. But let's look about the major objectives of that initial face-to-face call. Number one, you're going to want to establish rapport quickly. Secondly, you're going to want to confirm your understanding of the executive's key business issues. Next, you're going to want to demonstrate some level of capability. And lastly, you're going to want to create next steps that involve that executive. And again, lots of activities in the SellXL workshop around the area of establishing credibility and getting this return access to executives. So let's finish up with the last module of the workshop, which is on creating your value. When we ask executives that question, when you form partnerships with strategic suppliers, what benefits did you expect, and what benefits did you actually receive? Well, in blue here are the expected benefits, and in red are what the value received, at least from the perceived from the executive. And I call the difference the loyalty gap. Now let's talk about for a minute what some of the reasons for this loyalty gap may be. Some salespeople might say, well, you know, we sold more than we delivered. We sold them a concept, we weren't able to deliver exactly that concept. What about if you didn't communicate to the executive the value you actually deliver to them? How do you know that the executive understands the value you deliver to him or her? So you have to make sure that you communicate that value to the executive. Now, let's look at how you do that. Creating a value proposition. Number one, you have to look at 3 elements of a value proposition. Number one, the value that you personally deliver to that executive. Secondly, the value that you can bring with your resources from your company. And lastly, the value of your solution. Don't overlook any of these areas as you communicate value. All of them are part of your value proposition. And if you look then at how this overlaps the client's business initiative, here's where you're defining your specific business value. And this is most important. As you're talking to executives around the world, you need to be able to communicate your value. And if you look at the key elements of a value proposition, here are 3 key elements. Number one, you have to address the client's issues and focus on payback or consequences as it relates to the client's business initiative. In other words, what's important to the client. Secondly, you have to describe how you can help in both a qualitative and quantitative form. You have to describe how your solution creates value for the executive. And lastly, you have to demonstrate your capability. How have you demonstrated this particular capability in the past? Okay, now let's look at the format for a value proposition. And we give this template out in the workshop. We actually have salespeople develop a value proposition, as you'll see in a minute, for the case study that we use in the workshop. And you can see on this value proposition template what we're looking for in each of these areas. Now, I would tell you that it takes you some time, effort, and energy to develop a value proposition that looks like something you see on the screen right now. But if you can develop this template, and if you can deliver this information to the client, that executive will understand the value that you're trying to communicate to them. So what we do in the workshop is we use worksheets. We use templates like this. And we have salespeople use them in the workshop against the case study, but we also have them use it for their live sales opportunities. That's why we're using this process. That's why we're trying to formulate this process throughout that one-day workshop. So they get time to practice constructing a value proposition for the case study. And again, they have to focus on those three key questions. What's important to the client? How does our solution create value for the client? And then how can you demonstrate your capability? Where have you done something like this in the past? And here's a combination of kind of what we've talked about in this webinar today. Here's what Neil Rackham put in the foreword to our book, which is, again, associated with the SellXL workshop. The measure of these new salespeople is the value they create. And to create maximum value, they must understand the issues and concerns of their C-suite customers. This book is timely and essential reading for them. Let me summarize kind of what we've talked about today, and then I'm going to answer some of the questions that I see appearing on the screen right now. And again, any other questions that you want to key in. When calling at the executive level, you've got to make certain that you have done your homework and understand the industry as well as the client. Secondly, that you can conduct the conversation using the client's metrics. And again, as we said before, you know, no matter what industry you're talking about, you have to have an understanding of those key industry metrics. You have to have an understanding of how those metrics are used in the company that you're dealing with. You have to be using the client's terminology. You have to be having an understanding of their processes and how you can impact some of their key processes so that you can deliver value to the client's organization with your solution. Next, you have to be specific but concise in terms of your discussions with client executives, because that's how they like to operate. That's how executives like to operate. And when you're discussing value, you hopefully are talking at the executive level because they understand value. If you get down to lower levels of the organization, you're talking to an operations level person. That person may or may not understand value. They're looking at price and discounts. What I also say to salespeople is you have to be prepared to discuss the specific business value you will deliver to that particular customer executive and to their company. You know, what value will you deliver to the executive? And typically, when you're looking at executives, understand that there's a personal agenda of the executive and a business agenda of the executive. And if you can address both of those, the personal agenda and the business agenda, 1 + 1 will equal 5, because they then will align with you. Another thing I say to salespeople is never ask an executive a question whose answer could have been obtained from another source. Don't ask them questions that you could have answered by looking at the internet or by doing your research and getting the information. For example, some salespeople might think that asking an executive, what are your 3 top business issues, is a good question. I say a better question is, I understand your business issues to be X, Y, and Z. Which one of those is most important to you and why? That shows some insight. That shows some research that you've done. You're now asking the executive for their insight on which one of those is most important. You can't get that type of insight off the internet. You can get information off the internet, but perhaps not that level of insight. And lastly, you want to leave with the perception that you own the relationship. You own the relationship. So, again, I thank you all for coming, and I'm going to answer the questions now that I see appearing on the screen. One of them was, there seems to be an assumption that we already have a relationship with a prospective client. What if you know no one? How do you get started in getting to the key executive? Well, the first thing you have to do is do some research. Understand a little bit about that industry, about that particular company, and then about some of those key executives, and see if you can get a connection to one of those executives and get an introduction to one of those executives so that you can start developing relationships in the client organization. And then when you start developing those relationships, you'll get a better understanding of where you should be going in the client organization. You'll understand a little bit about how do you navigate some of the different relationships to get to the right executive. You'll start to see what's happening in the client organization. You'll be communicating with different executives in that organization. Then you have to start triangulating your information. You have to talk to different executives and then, like I said, triangulate that information so that you can then discover which of those executives you should or could call on. Another question came in about can we get a copy of this presentation? And the answer is absolutely. There will be a copy of this webinar on my website. It will appear at some later point in time, hopefully within the next 48 hours or so. I can't tell you it'll be there today, but hopefully within the next 48 hours, a copy of this webinar will be on my SellXL website. And again, you see the contact information here. Another question came from one of the attendees is, we sell across multiple industries and businesses. How do I discover their key metrics? And I can't see the rest of it, and top issues other than the internet. Well, there's lots of different sources that you can go to. You can go to the company themselves. You can go to conferences, industry conferences, where you can get additional information. You can go to the company, the company's marketing department, and get information from their marketing department. But don't downplay the internet. There's multiple areas and places you can go on the internet to get information about your client at those three levels of learning. And again, start using social networking as a way to get to different client executives. Facebook, LinkedIn, there are other social networking sources and resources that you can be using to get different information. So don't downplay any of those areas. Use all those sources. Any other questions? I'm looking at some of the questions here, trying to get to them. Hold on just a minute. If you are on inside sales, what are the decreased success rates in getting access via phone? Well, I think you have to try different approaches. We looked at the 4 different approaches to gaining access, and one of those was direct, where you contact the client executive directly. And although it had lower level of applicability with executives, I say still try some of those approaches. Perhaps in your industry, you may be able to get to the executive. I also have a Facebook fan page, and hopefully I'm going to put the access to it on my website. But again, use those different approaches, social networking, LinkedIn. There are many, many other sources that you can use to get information before you make that critical first call on a client. You want to be as totally prepared as you can be for making that call on the client and showing that client executive that you've made an investment, that you've done some homework on them, that you understand their industry, that you understand a little bit about their company. I don't see any other questions. I'll wait one more minute. How do I discover we talked about the metrics, how you get some additional metrics. So I've tried to answer the questions that I've seen come in. I've tried to answer them. I think I've answered all of the questions that I've seen at least appear on the screen. So I thank you again for attending this webinar. I hope you received value from it. And as you probably heard in my voice, I'm excited about the value that is delivered from this workshop. If you'd like additional information, either contact the person who referred you to this webinar or contact me directly. My contact information, again, is on the screen right now. A replay of this webinar will be available on my website. I thank you so much for attending this session today, and make it a great day. Thank you very much.